Hello, guys. Good day.
Good morning.
How are you, Mr. Simon?
I'm very well, Victor. How are you?
I'm all right. Lesego, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Victor?
I'm all right. Alim?
I'm well as can be as well. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Great stuff. The global shapers, I hope you guys are also keeping well. I also wish to welcome the online audience that we have from all corners of this world, and to just say we meet at a time when there's a standstill in the global economy. So we just want to chit chat and see from the global perspective, and also to see how the COVID-19 has affected lives in the global village, also in Botswana, and the part, most importantly, our interest is on the part that the young people of this global village can play to help the now generation and the future generation. So without much wastage of time, I would want to give the floor to Alim to give us a global perspective on the matter.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you each of you as well who are tuning in live through our Facebook channel as well. My name is Abdullahi and I'm with the World Economic Forum. And for the most part, I work with the Global Shapers team. The Global Shapers community, for those who don't know, it's a network of about 13,000 young people in over 420 cities around the world who convene teams or chapters in different major cities around the world. And they're tasked with developing local solutions for change in their local cities, as well as representing that young voice at the global level as well. And so we obviously have a chapter in Botswana too. And so I think today's discussion is really about a chance for us to look at what's happening globally and how do we link that back to Botswana as well. So just a few stats to give you guys a bit of context as well. And so I'm just going to read them out so I have it word by word as well. I'll start with the United States because I think that's, of course, the largest economy in the world. So for the week ending August 15th, so just over a month ago, 1.1 million Americans filed for unemployment. This is nearly double the record observed during the Great Depression in the late 1920s. So in the late 1920s, the peak was 650,000 Americans applying for unemployment per week. We're now almost doubled that in the United States. Over, I think, closer to our end of the world in the UK, they have suffered the worst recession of any major economy in the world. And I think there was some kind of account saying that it was the worst downturn in over 300 years. In the Middle East, and specifically the Gulf nations, the oil producing nations of the Middle East, they're expected to suffer their worst economic contraction in history. And I think more closer to home, in South Africa, they will definitely experience the longest recession since the end of apartheid. So I think this is kind of, it's four specific examples. It's one in North America, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, and one closer to home. But I think it just paints a picture of just the kind of level of economic decline we're expecting in 2021 and some of the implications that it will have for us as well. This is specifically bad for young people. So when you think about it, whenever there's an economic downturn, it means the chances of a young person getting their first job, their first internship, their first placement, whatever the example is, becomes that much harder. It means more likely that they will also experience more severe forms of underemployment too. So you might have one part-time gig here that lasts for a certain amount of times. You might be able to pick up a contract there, so on and so forth. But this is really not how you build a stable economy. This is not how you build stable livelihoods. And I think when 2008 financial crisis happened, so if we were to zoom in on the last biggest financial crisis we had, it gave rise to things like the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. In the global south, it gave rise to the Arab Spring, but all really just defined by young people saying this system is not working for me, and I want to reimagine something different. I want to highlight that because today's economic downturn is even worse. It's not even on the same scale as 2008, and so you can only imagine the degree of social and economic exclusion this will result into. So those who are in the outer peripheries of our society will be pushed out even further. Those who are about to have their first leg in, communities that were thinking this would be their year, this would be your chance to have your first job, to have your first home, that likelihood is pushed 10 steps back as well, so on and so forth. And it becomes this kind of like ripple effect throughout the world as well. And so when I think of COVID-19, for example, when I think of this pandemic, I don't just see it as a public health crisis. I really see it as a crisis within many crises. So again, like when you look at, in some countries, you have a major civil rights movement taking place, driven by the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, you also have a major climate crisis happening at the same time. You have this huge economic crisis that I kind of alluded to as well. All of these crises are beginning to surface under the guise of a public health crisis. So people can only really see the COVID crisis right now, but at the bottom are all these other crises that are beginning to resurface and come to the top. And as soon as the pandemic settles, that's when all of them will come rushing to the surface. And then you have a much bigger kind of challenge ahead of us as well. And so with that in mind, the World Economic Forum created this initiative called the Great Reset. And it's our most ambitious, it's our most consequential agenda. And the whole idea is to say, how do we reimagine our global systems, our economies, our political systems, our social systems, whatever your relationship is with a system, some governing force? How do we reimagine that relationship so that they operate more inclusively for everyone? And so that we don't keep having these recurring crises show up every 10 years or so. And I think for me, my message is always specifically to young people, because I think for the millennials of today, we're the first generation of youth to weather through 2 global recessions in our formative years. And so I think the anxiety of that, plus those of us who really want to see social change as well, it really just becomes an almost overwhelming experience to kind of go through. And so I really hope that more and more countries around the world center their recovery plans around young people, those who will weather the greatest consequence of downturns and crises, and those who will inevitably have to fix it as well. And so I'm hoping to come really from that perspective. And for me, it's, when I zoom in on the Botswana case, I think it's a country that has weathered quite well relative, let's say, to the subcontinent. And I think it's always kind of branded as the exception. So it may not have as high levels of corruption. It may not have as higher levels of debt. It might not have as high levels of youth unemployment. But I don't think that's a reason to rest on your laurels. I think the minute you do so, you take advantage of that. So the minute you just say, oh, well, I think it's not as bad as, let's say, neighboring country X, then you begin to forget just how inequitable, let's say, the gains from, let's say, the mineral sector is distributed across society. You begin to take advantage of just how concentrated youth employment is in certain cities, and how those who live in the rural parts are, for the most part, left behind. I think I'm optimistic about what I'm seeing, for example, with the focus on innovation and entrepreneurship, but it also is something that worries me. And the reason why I share that is because in the most advanced economies in the world, entrepreneurs have about a 10% likelihood of succeeding in their first 2 years. So 90% of their ventures typically fail in the first 2 years. So we're really investing our energy into a 10% industry, a 10% survival rate. At the same time, when you zoom in on that 10%, those that are the most successful ventures, even let's say from Silicon Valley or from China, because I mean, those are the 2 biggest tech markets. I think today a lot of people are wondering, are these companies really improving equality, or they're just contributing to inequality? And there's a bit of growing research that just shows how entrepreneurship is really a driver of wealth, not really a driver of job creation. And so it's something for us to also think about as countries in the global south, to think about, how do we make sure, if we are going to drive more of our economic recovery around entrepreneurship and innovation, that it's not something that then kind of like recreates bubbles of inequality, where those who are able to create these technologies do very well for themselves and the people around them, and those who are without become even more without. So to say that that gap between the haves and have-nots is only really amplified, because that has certainly been the case in the global north as well. So something for us to factor in as well. And just as a final point before I pass it over to you, Victor, when I think of the Great Reset, I also think about resetting the ways in which young people call for change. I love the energy around today's young change makers, especially the teenagers, for example, around the world, who are very emboldened and who are very creative in the ways in which they ask for change. But what I've also seen in the last year is that more of these younger change makers are beginning to realize that nothing has really changed since they've started calling for change. I mean, the most famous, I think, teenage activist in the world right now is a young climate activist from Sweden, Greta Thunberg. And in our summit earlier this year, the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, she said to the audience, pretty much nothing has been done since I've started staging these school strikes. I mean, we've raised a lot of awareness. Young people are a lot more emboldened about the climate movement, but it hasn't really translated to any real change. And so I hope as different systems and governments and economies think about their new normal, that we young people as well start thinking about what is our new normal in the ways in which we ask and advocate for social change. What are the ways in which we demand for different systems to operate around us? And so for me, it's a case of saying, you know, we need to go above the idea of being heropreneurs. And this is the idea of that one person can suddenly create change for 1 million people. It really does not work in that way. Social change is a very long-term process. It takes a long time to do that. We also have to realize that entrepreneurship, this is the idea that a private business with a good social heart is going to change the world. Unfortunately, the world is a lot more tricky than that. When you think about change, it relates to three things. It's the three Ps: people, power, politics. A social enterprise is not built to deal with people, power, and politics. It just isn't. So we have to think about ways in which we can make our activism a lot more structural, a lot more systemic, because the solutions ahead of us are also extremely, extremely entrenched and systemic themselves as well. So I'm going to pause maybe on that note before I before I ramble and lose maybe some of the audience watching tonight or today, regardless of where you're calling in from. But yeah, just some context for us to guide today's discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Alim. It's insightful what you've been saying there. And now I want to, Mr. Simon, to bring this issue closer to home, but with much interest on the disruption that we see in the future of workplace. Part of the global system has been changing, and we have seen that there's also change in the workplace. So if you could just zoom in on that and share your experience with us.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Abdullahi, for that context. I think you raised a lot of very interesting points, obviously from a global point of view, but I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic. And obviously that Botswana is not as affected relative, as you say, to the rest of the region. But you raise an important point that it doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels. We need to keep applying ourselves and thinking, as you say, reimagining what the possibilities could be. So to this point, I just wanted to give that context in terms of how do we begin to reimagine the future, and what does the future of work for communities, for society look like? And I think, one of the first points I want to start with is just really talking about the human capital issues or the human capital quotient and balance sheet that countries have, because effectively economies are driven by the human capital that you have at your disposal. And really what we're seeing from a global context, given the disruption, as you say, not just from a health point of view, but even some of those sub-pillars within the health crisis across the economy, is this disruption. And what that means is you need to start preparing your human capital today, not just your currently engaged workforce, but also those students that are in the education system, all the way from primary to secondary, right through tertiary and continuous learning, to transition to this future of work. And then you also have to elevate the human experience, right? Because if you don't, as you say, have that P for people at the center of this learning experience, you're really investing in a zero-sum game. And then how do you actually optimize the experience of workers and employees and entrepreneurs across, so that we can contract differently from a social point of view? So the question is, what is the social contract between various stakeholders in terms of the future of work, right? And so what we're seeing, there's basically three phases: economies, individuals, and organizations go through. And I think with the onset of the pandemic, we were in the first phase, which was really a respond phase. and then you transition into a recovery phase, which I think most economies are in now. And then once you've had that successful recovery, you can then thrive and you sort of go on that upswing. But if you look at traditional companies, traditional organizations, how their business models have been affected and impacted. If you look at mining companies or product-related entities, their entire operating models have been disrupted. The supply chains have been disrupted. And what we are seeing now in terms of the profession that I'm in, from a management consulting point of view, is that technology has become, although it has caused a great disruption, it has also become a great enabler. So what we're seeing with platforms is that they have the power to actually level the playing field in terms of social inclusion. We are seeing that they can provide an opportunity for entrepreneurs to scale and, importantly, to innovate. And I think what this crisis has presented is an opportunity for people to really self-reflect and innovate and see how do they go about solving some of the problems that we're seeing around security of supply, especially if you're talking about food security, energy security, and fuel. So we have a number of examples, obviously, that we can use from the Ubers, the Airbnbs, who have actually done this quite successfully, notwithstanding the disruption in their own businesses. But to your point, Victor, the future of work is really around reimagining the opportunities for local communities to be included and to participate, not only in global value chains, but local value chains. Because what we're seeing with economies is that, for example, Botswana being a landlocked economy, we had an over-reliance on imports, whether it was fuel, retail goods, consumer goods. And the second the pandemic hit, those global supply chains were cut off, and we were cut off effectively from the rest of the world. It was only the communication technologies that enabled us to engage. So the reimagining and the future of work is really around how do you reconfigure business, social, operating and ecosystem partnerships to enable local supply chains, local value chains to meet local demand, but still remain relevant within a global context. And we are seeing this really across mining. We're seeing this across transport and logistics, across agriculture. And one case actually that I just wanted to highlight to our audience is that in South Africa, there's a crowd that's actually looking at agriculture in terms of cattle farming, where they are taking that onto a social platform, an application where anybody around the world can actually buy an equity stake in their cattle ranch. So you can buy shares in a cow, you can buy a number of cows, and that really has a really unique value proposition because it's empowering local communities around the agriculture sector, but it's also plugging them into global value chains and providing a unique source of funding into their business and into their operations, which is quite unique. At home, again, Victor, we are seeing a focus from the government and also from an entrepreneurship around agriculture, which is looking at how do you digitize the agricultural value chain by using smart devices like IoT devices, which will allow you to actually monitor the temperature, the climate, the humidity that's required for your plants to grow, and actually extract that data and start using smart technologies to increase yield and increase productivity. And those are just some of the areas. Obviously, mobile payment solutions is also quite a key area. But the point of all of these technologies and these examples I'm highlighting is that it will require a concerted shift, okay? A shift and a pivot in mindset. And I think this speaks to your point, Abdullah, here around, I know you advocate quite a lot in terms of youth movements. You've mentioned the Arab Spring and the likes, and I know you're a big advocate for political change, driven by the youth. At the same time, I think Botswana, we need to have this concerted mindset shift from a reliance on other people doing things for us and recognizing the power within a collective movement, and thinking differently around the outcomes that we desire, which comes back to the reimagining of the future and the future of work. And if we can do that through these public-private dialogues, very much like what we're doing now, I think we can then start arriving at a point where we can discuss the required changes and contract and compact with each other along social lines, private, public, not-for-profit organization, development partners, and so on, around the reconfiguration of these value chains and opportunities for private sector entrepreneurs and the youth. It's not easy, as you've mentioned. It requires being very transparent, having fierce conversations, and Botswana are not traditionally violent people, and have really tough conversations. But I think it's presenting quite a unique opportunity, the disruption that we're seeing, for us to actually have these conversations. And I think the economies that do this sooner rather than later, and as I say, that innovate faster, will build resiliency and will build the necessary sustainability that is required to actually be successful in the long term. But maybe let me pause there and also get reflections from the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. Now, Lesego, we speak of reset, and part of the presentation of Simon, you mentioned the issue of empowerment of citizens in terms of economically. Where are we as a country? How do we define citizen economic empowerment? And is that the ideal way of defining it? Is there something that we can learn from the outside world that we could actually localize and help our people as part of the reset?
Thank you so much, Victor. I think that's a very key and important issue that we do need to discuss today around citizen empowerment and what that really looks like, particularly in the Great Reset, because COVID-19 obviously presents us an opportunity to do things very differently. So specifically looking at that issue, we really do need to reset how we think about our legislative and regulatory framework around citizen empowerment. I think we as Botswana are known for having wonderful policies on paper, wonderful acts and bills that speak towards citizen empowerment, but then the reality and the actionable things that we see around those bills does not really reflect what we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. So this is a real and important time. I like the word that Abdullahi uses. I think we'll keep hearing it again since Simon also used it, the reimagining of what citizen empowerment really looks like and what it takes to actually make that happen. So this is important, and I want to use a real example here around the issue of the import bill. And I think Simon highlighted that we have an increasing import bill every single month, and it's been growing over the past couple of years. And right now, the Ministry of Trade passed this industrial act that kind of gave preservations to citizens, and there were certain trading licenses that were reserved for citizens, but we didn't even begin to consider the kind of prohibitive, prohibitive actions that you actually need to take into consideration before you even begin to start the preserved businesses on that list. So there are about 10 or 12 businesses, majority of them are manufacturing, and the cost that it takes to set up a manufacturing business is not really been thought about. The compliance issues that you have to really think about around that was not really considered. And so while there are organizations like CEDA and BDC and NDB that are funding these businesses, but we can't even begin to fund them if they can't even enter into those businesses. So we need to really create a holistic value chain around start to finish in terms of our citizen empowerment. It shouldn't just be about funding. It shouldn't just be about the bill, but what is the trading licenses requirements required for you to start that business? What will it take for you to be compliant and all of those things? So that's how we need to start looking at citizen empowerment in a very holistic way. And that's not very disjointed as we're seeing currently with a lot of the laws that are being passed currently. We also need to encourage and capacitate resilience within our businesses, as Simon highlighted as well. And this is through thinking about the redundancies that we should be actually creating, particularly around the government passing laws that will ensure that businesses, larger ones in Botswana, think about having more localized operations. I don't think we'll ever completely remove globalization. I think we're past that point and it will always have a place, but I do think we need a focus, particularly on localizations of businesses in this country, so that we can continue to exist and thrive and empower citizens to participate gainfully in our economy. We know that we have been feeling, there's a general feeling of lack of real gainful participation in the economy for indigenous citizens in our country. And then the last thing around the legislative and regulatory framework of how we should be doing things is we need to create an environment of where market forces can continue to prevail, that in a way that is equitable for all people who want to participate in our economy. So what we've seen is, businesses will continue to start, some will fail. That's the nature of entrepreneurship. We shouldn't make it about COVID per se being the reasons why businesses are failing, but rather let's continue to create an environment where businesses can start and fail and all market forces prevail without necessarily favoring specific entities and actors within our economy. And I think that really requires aggressive protectionist laws, which we are very shy to aggressively pursue as a country. And I think there's a real opportunity there for us to continue to protect all people who want to participate in our economy equitably and sustainably. So that's the first point around, citizen empowerment and equity. The second thing I want to highlight, which is which I think also Abdullahi pointed towards, but I think I wanted to really zone in on the importance and the role of public leadership and how we need to rethink public leadership during this time, and how it can really help with the Great Reset and bringing back a lot of our economies. What we saw happening in 1918 with the Spanish flu is, despite the greater devastating effects in that it affected primarily young, able-bodied people, the recovery in the economy was actually much faster than what we will probably experience during this time. And the reason was, particularly in the US, was World War I was happening at the same time. And so there was aggressive government spending from individuals and citizens, and also, the need for services for the war effort. So that was happening at the same time. There was also aggressive acts at the time that were speaking towards industrialization. Henry Ford had just come into the scene. Electrification was going on at the same time. And so these are primarily driven from a public sector perspective. And as a technocracy, I think Botswana is really a technocracy in essence. There's a real opportunity for us to aggressively think about how we can resuscitate our economy on that scale, because I think it will require large scale projects for us to really bring back the economy. So the government should create an environment and an ecosystem for faster recovery. And I don't think we can rely solely on the private sector to do so. And so I think whilst our governments have been retracting and the role of government has been peeling back over the last couple of years, I think there's still an opportunity for public leadership to really shine during this time and turn things around for a lot of people. And then the last point that I wanted to bring up was access to financing, being an issue that I'm particularly interested in. I think there's a real opportunity for us to rethink how we fund big projects and also entrepreneurship, particularly in Botswana. I think we will likely see, and I'm hoping this will be the case, more innovative funding, where we're not funding the typical conservative types of businesses that we're so used to funding, the safer businesses that we're used to funding. I think there is an opportunity, particularly for government, because I think investment funds, equity funds will likely be have a lesser risk appetite during this time. And so I think government now has an opportunity to really fund forward-thinking, futuristic, tech-specific projects, climate change projects, food security projects, agriculture-based projects that will really bring about the change that we're trying to see within our country. And also just in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. I think we need to also really aggressively and innovatively fund the informal sector. I think for a while we've completely ignored the sector for across the world, really, in terms of banking, insurance, accessing financing, and just the number of things that we could be doing. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to put our informal sector first, because we saw that most of them were actually frontline workers. Most of them were the ones that held our economies together. And so I think this is a real opportunity for us to actually be serious and intentional about how we fund the informal sector. So I think those are the three key issues that I think are very important towards us really speaking and delving deep into the issue of citizen empowerment.
All right, great. Thanks. Thanks, Lesego. Alim, I see you're nodding there and probably want to add something on what Lesego has said. But as you do that, please also answer the question of how then do we balance the interest of the citizens and the interest of the global, of an interconnected world, where the issue of globalization has come, and lately we have seen countries trying to protect their own people. How do we move forward?
Awesome, thank you for that. I think, Lesego made some, really on the point mentions, and I think just to add to what she had already said, I think this pandemic, I think, is the resurgence of government. I think around the world, but I think maybe even more specifically in Africa as well. It's shown to us how, first of all, underfunded and under-resourced our public health systems are, how less than resilient our education systems were. And I think for a very long time, we've had this idea that if government steps back and doesn't regulate the market will do well, and there will be ripple effects and ripple benefits for everyone as well. I want to highlight just one very important essay that was published actually 50 years ago from last weekend. And it's an essay that was titled, "The Social Responsibility of a Business is to Make Profits." Now, I think for many people our age, I think in today's world, it's not really an essay that has such name recognition or whatnot, but I have to say it's probably the most influential economic piece of the 20th century. And I think including into the 21st century as well. It was titled, again, "The Social Responsibility of a Business is to Make Profits." And one of the economists, the key economist, Milton Friedman, he argued that I think when the market is able to do whatever it wants, that you don't have these protections policies by government, you don't have any regulations enforced by government, that the market will do extremely well, and that it will also provide benefits to workers and to communities at the same time too. 50 years on from that social experiment, it's shown the exact opposite has happened. Yes, it gives tremendous wealth to the top earners within the business community, but it ravishes the environment, it exploits workers, and it doesn't provide as much benefits for the communities as well. So I think a government which actually has a mandate to really reflect the interests of the people, it's now a reflection to say, it's now time for us to step up and to step back again, because this whole idea of us stepping back and letting the unrestricted market do its thing and that it will naturally just solve everything does not work. At the same time, we've seen that by stepping back for a long time, our health systems have not been working to the level that they should be. Our education systems have not collected enough tax revenue to be able to get to the points that they are. So I really, really think at its core, COVID-19 should be the resurgence of government and public leadership as well. And just to Lesego's point, I also think it's a call to action to also see more younger voices represented in our political decision making as well. And by young, I don't just mean the fact that you came into this world after the year 1988 or 1987 is reason now for you just by sheer luck to now be the head of government. I'm really not of that opinion. I really think it's about time we had people who had the right enthusiasm, the right desire, those who are with their peer group who represent the majority of the continent, to really represent that voice in the halls of power as well, to really be there in the decision-making process too, because the reimagining, the redesign, the reinvigoration of Botswana is really dependent on who's at that table. And those who are at that table, if they're of the same kind of status quo, then you'll just see a continuation of that. And even if they are from the status quo and have great intentions, you will only see an extension of great intentions. So if you have lived experiences, if you have access to a peer group that represents the majority of your country, and I think young people inherently do, you need to bring that enthusiasm, those unique ideas, that energy, and match it with the unique experience and wisdom of those older than us who've been in the halls of power for a long time too. I really, really believe at our core, the biggest savior that we can see in government is intergenerational allyship. merging those who know, who have the wisdom, who have the experience, with those who have the ideas, the enthusiasm, and at the same time, the naivety to believe in something different. Because once you've been in the system for a long time, it's very, very hard to imagine something different, because your mind is always in that practical mindset, which has its pros, but also undermines your ability to reimagine. So I think once you're able to bring those two demographics together, you can really, really see something come out very different to maybe the status quo of today. So I really just want to highlight that essay one more time. The social responsibility of a business is to make profits. That essay was published in the late 70s. It's been 50 years since it came out in the New York Times. It became the most influential document in studying the behavior of big business around the world, and the fact that governments thought, let's just deregulate our markets because that's the best thing we can do. And it just turned out to be an absolute disaster. So I think it's important for Botswana as well to realize, as a government, it needs to be a mix between free and restricted market. And you have to regulate where it makes sense for the people, not necessarily where it makes sense for a big business head or where it makes sense for a trade representative. It really has to make sense for the people first and foremost. At the same time, there is a balancing act, because I really do believe that one of the greatest things that could come out in this century for our continent is the resurgence of Pan-Africanism as well. But I think for the most part, when we think of Pan-Africanism, it's really the talking points of more of the well-to-do Africans, whether they be on the continent or the diaspora, of this whole idea of saying, let's open our borders, let's provide free trade, so on and so forth. I really, really think we need to make that message far more grassroots and make it a reality that benefits those in the informal sector, the everyday person, as well as those in the halls of power too. Because we can't have a top-down approach saying, the African Union now has rectified this bill, and so every country right now needs to have this open border policy, so on and so forth, because really there will be a backlash to that in the long term. I think when we begin to think of Pan-Africanism at the grassroots level, then I think we're able to more practically balance national interests, which should be priority A, with the need to also see a regional resurgence of the continent so that it could also play and compete at that global level. And so that doesn't just end up being like the playing ground of a China or any other kind of foreign power as well. So it is a delicate act, but I think at its core, it means government needs to step up. It also means that citizens who actually elect governments and whose government is a mandate to represent them also need to step up, whether that be to vote, whether that be to hold them accountable, or whether that means to run yourself, or of course to work in the public sector machinery either. But at its core, I think it means we need to see a resurgence of government, and one that reflects national interests, but also has the heart and humanity to also reflect that regional Pan-Africanism at the same time too.
Thank you very much. Simon, speaking of regulation by government, we have seen in the past few years in Botswana where we have had the government actually paying university fees for a lot of Botswana. And this has resulted in a lot of them being on the streets. They don't have jobs. And do you think as a human capital specialist or someone who has an insight on those areas, do you think going forward we need to reshape where we put our money, or do we still need to use the same traditional model that we are using now? If you could speak on that. And then also on the second point, please speak on the need of the internet infrastructure. Botswana has so many villages, and the interest here is to say how do we get the people, or a people who is in Chanoga, for instance, to be part of the learners, online learners. We saw when we had the national lockdown that schools were forced to go online, but we know very well that some rural villages don't have internet.
Thanks, Victor. So yeah, absolutely. I want to just start in responding that everything that we're talking about has to be guided obviously by some strategy. So all governments, economies, you start with your national strategy, right? Whatever it is the country wants to achieve, either through its national development plans or other, has to be documented, has to be agreed upon, and importantly, to Alim's point, has to actually reflect the aspirations of the people, and not a select, minority that are in power and have control. So the national strategy is quite critical. We have a vision document in Botswana, and of course, the challenge, I think the balance is always translating something that's overly aspirational and somewhat theoretical into tangible and actionable and implementable plans, right? So that's the first thing. And once you can translate that strategy into key sectors or pillars where you can then have your implementation plans, which are in your NDPs, etc., then you can look at how do you need to reconfigure. And you'll hear me keep using this word of reconfiguring. To your point, Victor, we definitely need to reconfigure and relook our human capital and talent management strategy for the country, okay? Which really requires a concerted re-evaluation of our entire curriculum development program. As I mentioned earlier, from pre-primary, primary, secondary, all the way through to tertiary, in order to achieve the aspirations and the strategy as stated in our transformation and our national strategies. Because if we recognize all the disruption that we've spoken about, everything that Lesotho was saying earlier, and we know business, social ecosystems are not going to look the same in the next year, let alone the next 5 years. What does the future Botswana in Chanoga, in Kang, in Kanye, in Soroe look like 5 years from now, 25 years from now? And we have to start preparing the curriculum and preparing the tools and the technologies and teaching these kids about these things now and empowering them. And for me, that is the beginning of empowerment. Exactly as Lesotho mentioned, it's not about throwing money at SMMEs. It's great to have all the policies, as you mentioned, Lesotho, but they are on paper. But what does a policy mean to the kid in Zoroga? It means nothing, because they are not empowered. They're not meaningfully or gainfully employed or empowered. So absolutely, Victor, our human capital development, our curriculum, our institutions of learning, we need to come together. We need to re-evaluate and look at the mismatch between the graduates that are coming out of universities today and the actual demands and the requirements of the corporate world, of the political world, in terms of what is actually required to move the economy, move societies forward. And there's a significant mismatch, as you rightfully mentioned, Victor. So that's quite important. And I think what needs to be done there, as you mentioned also, Lesotho, is that government needs to start thinking to a large extent, I believe, Alim, along corporate principles. And what I mean by this is that it starts to start making big bets and making the right bets. We need to start taking the right risks. And if government does that, it means it's shifting its development planning and saying, where will we invest our limited resources, our limited time, our limited capacity, capabilities, in order to achieve the highest return on investment? And by return on investment, it's not just monetary. Return on investment measures include social equity and social inclusion. And that is the matrix that needs to be applied in terms of funding projects. And I think this is what you were speaking to, Lesotho. And that's why I'm saying it's around funding of productive assets. So investment in education, investment in our healthcare infrastructure, which leads me to the second point, the second question that you asked in terms of internet infrastructure, right? That is a critical enabler if you look at most emerging and developed economies. You spoke of a number of case studies earlier on, Alim. You can look at the Singapores, the South Koreas in Europe, the Estonias and others in terms of what they've achieved around e-government, which really brought a large number of previously marginalized communities and economies into the productive economy. So absolutely, Victor, investment in productive infrastructure like our fiber and our telecommunications backbone across the country is a critical enabler and actually a prerequisite If we are going to talk about entering the fourth industrial revolution, being part of the knowledge economy and having services that are not just for local consumption, but can be exported into global value chains to consumers around the world. This is critical. We do have quite a robust backbone infrastructure, but the challenge now that we have in Botswana is the cost of access to that infrastructure to communities that don't have that access, where you see high data usage costs, we've got Wi-Fi costs and so on, which are quite prohibitive. And you don't have as much proliferation in terms of smartphones across the country. So absolutely, if you have a strong backbone and infrastructure, fiber or wireless or otherwise, it will eventually result in a reduction in access and costs to these communities. Now, if you merge this with human capital development in terms of the right curriculum, in terms of the right technologies, experiential learning, what that then does from an informal sector point of view, from an SME point of view, is it creates a catalyst in terms of innovation, where people can now in their communities where they are, come up with solutions, come up with apps, come up with ways of connecting demand and supply drivers within their communities and start participating in the local and regional economy. But if you provide access in terms of internet, fiber, and infrastructure, but people don't know how to use these technologies and are excluded and don't have that awareness, it's really, again, a zero-sum game. So that's why I mention these prerequisites, both the human capital development in terms of the right curriculum and knowledge of these tools and technologies, and access to affordable, relevant, cheap infrastructure. And then you will start seeing these synergies which give rise to innovation, you know. And I just want to touch on financing again, which you mentioned, Lesego, and why I say government must make big bets and must make the right bets. Because it's not about saying we have 1,000 priorities. How do we split this pool of money amongst these thousands? That has got to shift. And this is the mindset shift. It's about saying, what are the 5 priorities given our national strategy that we need to invest in, because the ROI, not just monetary, but social equity and others, is going to have the biggest benefit for the average Botswana out there, which then necessarily requires government to think innovatively about hybrid financing mechanisms, which you spoke about, and I believe there is a space and a window of opportunity currently for government to enter into these public-private partnerships, especially for infrastructure rollout. Of course, government does play a leading role because these infrastructures effectively, it's a utility, right? It's like road or water. They must lay the groundwork, and it is government's role to do that. But then the private sector must play also a responsibility in terms of ensuring that connectivity and that access. So 100% spot on, Victor. I think those are the 3 points I wanted to make in terms of the human capital development, fit for purpose and fit for future in terms of the curriculum, the infrastructure development and backbone, and then these innovative financing solutions from a PPP point of view, quite critical.
Thank you very much. Lesego, you have much interest on issues relating to finance and enterprise development. And what we have actually seen on the ground in Botswana is that we are in a situation where few Botswana are financially literate. And then secondly, we have had for so many years government being obsessed with foreign direct investment, and that on its own affected the development of citizen-owned enterprises. And we are at a point where now part of the money of public funds were used for infrastructure development. Some of those infrastructures are depleted by now. They need some sort of renovation. They are not up to date. So how then do we move forward? Who then needs to come in and do what in a situation where a large majority of people are financially literate? They don't necessarily have knowledge on running enterprises. And then we have a government who's now running budget deficit for the last 3 years, and they're projecting deficit for the next 3 years at least. who needs to do what for us to at least survive the current pandemic?
Thanks, Victor. I think that's a very key and important question, and I feel like it will require a lot of more thought around what we can do, because I think it's a complex and multi-layered issue, and it's not very straightforward. But what I will say is, when we look at the way we operate as a government, particularly in Botswana, and the kind of capabilities that we have, I think we have a great opportunity to learn from past in our history and how we operated before. And I think a simple thing as our Khotla system is a great learning tool for us to be using currently. And that is primarily around decentralization. I think we kind of deny the importance of decentralizing our government a little bit further. So it's not necessarily about the funding, but how we operate and how do we use what we have, the little resources that both Simon and you mentioned. So it's important for us to think about how do we operate in a way that's very efficient. And I think decentralization offers us a great opportunity to be a bit more specific and channel our resources well within our areas. I think, as I said before, because Botswana is such a technocratic government, I do think we already have the skills, we already have the thinking and capacity to do the things that we need to do, but we cannot expect for it to happen if there's power that is concentrated at the very top. And that is what we're seeing currently. And I think we've seen small examples of that happening. I think everybody likes to bring up the issue of water. The moment we centralized water, we started having the big issues that we're having currently with water. So those are some of the things that I think it's just about operational issues, not necessarily funding, but just operational issues. The second thing is obviously monitoring and evaluation. I think it's a fun, cool buzzword that we're using currently, but we've never really seen it effectively working for us as a country per se, particularly around those large-scale projects that you spoke about that we've seen fail dismally, unfortunately, and at the cost of the taxpayer. And so I think the monitoring and evaluation isn't some stationary body that sits there and monitors and informs the government that this is what should have happened. But I think this is a collective responsibility of the citizenry. I don't think we force the government to account enough. And I think that is really sits on the responsibility of us as citizens. And I think there's a great opportunity for us to insist and push our public sector to do better, for lack of a better word. We just cannot allow or expect them to do it on their own. So that is a very key and important issue. The third thing that I want to mention is also just the accessibility of information. And I think there's a lack of information accessibility around what is going on, especially at a large scale, at a government scale, in terms of to normal citizens within the country. So I don't think there's enough information. And I think that is to the fourth estate. So it's to you, Victor, to also do better in providing the information that the citizens need to make better and informed decisions, to put the right people in the right places so that we can sort of see a better management of our resources in the country. So I think those are the actors that would need to step in to rectify some of the challenges we've seen.
Now, Alim, how then do we learn from the past and ensure that we actually bring everyone else on board? Because one thing that we get to realize is that we are not on the same board. But if you look, for instance, in the SACU region, in terms of industrialization, we have the big brother South Africa having most industries, and small countries like Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland were reliant on South Africa, and that is why we have a high import bill in Botswana. But we need to move to a point where each and every member state of this economic bloc could benefit. How do we move forward without necessarily hurting foreign policies in your thinking, Alim?
Yeah, I think just in preparation for this call, I started to look at some of the discussions that came about after the 2008 financial crisis. And a lot of the language that was used then seems very similar to what we're discussing now, in that, people are grappling with topics like industrialization, they're grappling with topics such as social equity, they're thinking about the whole concept of reimagining systems. The reason why I share this is just to suggest that as much as we are awakened and connected to this urgency for reform, we're never really the first. And this is where I think the whole concept of learning from the past, listening to the future, this intergenerational conversation becomes very important. And I always say, whenever you go into a topic, you have to spend and dedicate some amount of time studying your activism, studying your the area in which you're looking to change, because you will always find a group of people before you who may not be high profile, who may not be as obvious, and they may not necessarily be at the front, but there could be people who've tried it before. Maybe they were burnt out by the system. Maybe they experienced too much resistance. Maybe they were just drowned out by a sea of people who had different interests. I will always say, if you look deeper into any social topic, any form of development, even I would say even a geopolitical issue too, you will always find somebody who has great ideas in the past who didn't necessarily take it as far as they were hoping to. And there's a great potential in being able to study their efforts. Where were their pitfalls? How far did they manage to get ahead? What were some of the complexities and challenges that were up against them? Because, really to be able to change systems and to reimagine, the first step is you need is information. Because otherwise you do act from a place of ignorance. And you suddenly realize, oh my God, this is far more complex than I ever imagined. So to really build up your understanding of the current and to understand how did we even get to this place, take some time. Really, they're not the people who are at the front of your media stories. They're not the people who are so obvious to us. Look into the past and examine all those people before us who've tried, who've burnt out, who've walked away, who've been disillusioned by the prospects for change. There's tremendous wisdom and learning in what they have to share. And I think from there, you have to build on that legacy, build on that effort. So if ever there's a topic as tricky as trying to manage between industrialization, geopolitics, foreign policy, so on and so forth, I mean, the complexity is just, it's very stark and obvious. I always say the first thing to do is build up your information base. Look into those who've attempted to do it before you. Look into those who, and again, it's not the obvious ones. It's not the previous ministers necessarily. It's not necessarily the heads of different associations. You will find those voices very much in the outer of those conversations. It's those who walked away. It's those who said, oh my God, I tried to do this within government, but it was so unbelievably difficult. It's those who represented, maybe let's say the Informal Workers Association in the 1980s, let's say, for example. It's those who've done this kind of work and didn't necessarily get it as far as they had hoped. And unfortunately, because of that, the change process ended with them. So your responsibility today is not necessarily to think that you are starting from scratch, or not necessarily to be betrayed by your desire to create change by assuming you're the first. It's really to go back into history. It's really to go back and research, and then figure out, why did it not work? What were the intricacies that we were up against? Were there players across the border, as for example, you're saying in South Africa, who had greater power imbalance between our relations versus their relations? If that's the case, what are the conversations that we also need to spark in across the border? Maybe it's a inter-country kind of conversation. It'll come out only from looking into that information set. And again, it's not the obvious ones. It's not the ones who you would like think, oh my God, that's exactly where I would have taken it. For example, I'll give you an example that's more American focused, but it's I think a little more obvious as well. Black Lives Matter, this movement that's really taken off and started in the US, but now it's a global conversation. It's the biggest civil rights movement in US history. So if you can think of what was happening in the 1960s with Martin Luther King and the likes, we are living through the same conversation today. And if you're not seeing the correlations between the two, you're not following it as closely, to be honest. The success of Black Lives Matter is that they realized that the civil rights movement in the 1960s did not go as far as it did because it was centralized in one person, Martin Luther King. So it meant that by the detractors, those who didn't want to see civil rights come and become a thing, if they went after him, it also meant that they went after the movement. And what happened was, and this is something that I don't think many people realize today, in the final years of Martin Luther King, in his final year, I think it was about 75% of the American public thought he was irrelevant. And that included about 60-something% of African Americans as well. They were able to stop the movement because they went after the person, because the leadership was so centralized in one person. Black Lives Matter is decentralized entirely. Nobody knows really the face of the movement because anyone and everyone can really take up the cause. It means more and more people adopt the activism. It's not centralized in one person, so you can't necessarily undermine the movement by undermining one person. But I share this example just to say, those who thought of the civil rights movement in 2013, 2014, this was when Black Lives Matter came up, they had to study the efforts of those who came before them. They had to really examine, where did success happen? Where were the pitfalls? Why did it stop? And how do we make sure that we can have a resurgence of this movement, but not in the same way that undermines its progress like before? That model can be mapped against any issue that you're trying to solve: economic, political, social, so on and so forth. So any system that you're trying to redesign and make it more inclusive to those who are following, first step is to study your activism. First step is to look at the legacy that predates you and really understand, not necessarily just why they succeeded or why they made small successes, but more importantly, why they did not succeed to the levels that they had intended. What were those pitfalls? That helps you design your activism. That helps design your reimagining. And it doesn't have to necessarily be from an activism lens. I'm just using it as an example. Whatever it is, industrialization, whatever it is, it starts really from getting that information set as vast as possible, so that you don't get into a position where you burn out and kind of stop because you're up against the same pitfalls and obstacles as those before you. So I would always just recommend that as your first step. Study your legacy, study what predates you, because that will give you the best direction to think of the future.
Thank you very much. We have just about 15 minutes to wrap up, but before we do, I also want you guys to touch base on the role that the youth need to play, because if you look at the population of Botswana, if you look at the population of Africa, it's largely youth. So Lesego, if you could speak to a youth in Botswana who's, let's say, who's staying in urban areas, what would you say to them in terms of issues relating to us trying to reset and moving at the same speed with the rest of the world?
Definitely. I think for me, just from my own personal experience, I'll speak to this aversion towards public sector and public leadership. And I think it's really important for us to rethink how we can engage meaningfully within the civil service. I think it's important for us to, as youth in particular, to find talented and capable people to join the public sector, because I think the opportunity is vast for us to be part of large-scale national projects that actually have a direct impact on the lives of an everyday Botswana. And so I think it's really important for us during this time to rethink our priorities as individuals, as youth. There's a place, of course, for entrepreneurship. There's a place, of course, for social entrepreneurs. And I think we will continue to see that push and that excitement and enthusiasm around that. But I really do want us to think about the public sector in a way that we do need talented and you know, vibrant young people to be part of the civil service, to change the way we've been doing things, and to really help us come back and peel back some of the challenges that we're going to experience moving forward. It's going to be a long road back, I think. And I think it requires the kind of energy and dynamism that young people have. And so I think it's really important for us to rethink public leadership for not just the old and the deeply experienced. I know a lot of the adverts, the job adverts that we see, particularly in public service, are always like 15 years experience and 7,000 degrees. But I do think there is an opportunity for young people to participate meaningfully. And because it's the scale of the projects that they'll be a part of, it's the scale of the decision-making that they can be a part of in public service.
Great. Simon, we probably need to reset, and you're probably sitting there and having 2 or 3 sectors that you feel could be reset in Botswana. Which one would you pick as those?
I don't know if I can pick 1 or 2, Victor, but yes, absolutely, we do need to reset. Of course, I've spoken quite a bit around digital and the need for infrastructure, and that's an enabler. So if I was forced to pick, 2, I would definitely say the agricultural sector definitely needs to be reset, and the resetting would take place by the infusion of technology, because that allows productivity gains to increase exponentially. Economies, if you look at the, contribution to GDP, there's a thing called total factor productivity. And Botswana has a very low TFP relative to other economies. And the only way that we can increase our total factor productivity is leveraging technologies and enablers, okay? So agriculture definitely one, and also given the context of Botswana. And as I say, that would increase productivity. But the second is really digital, because that allows us to compete on a global scale, right? And it allows us to restructure and reconfigure our supply chains. So those are the sectors that I think need to definitely be reset. Of course, a close third, a competing third would be the education sector. Absolutely, that needs to be completely reset, reprioritized, reconfigured, and all other reasons that you can think of, just to give us that competitive advantage. But the last point I just want to make, Victor, just to add on to, it's not just it's not one sector or which sectors need to be reset. It's about taking a holistic view around what are the initiatives and interventions from a policy, political, everything we've been talking about, what needs to be done that has a multiplier effect and synergies. So it's cross-sectoral, right? It's very complex, as we've been saying. It's not one particular sector, because then you look at the impact and the outcomes. It's multi-sectoral, multi-impact, and you're sort of looking at that and saying, where would the highest impact and benefit come from? And of course, as long as it's driving inclusive growth. And I think these are the conversations that we need to have now. And the last point I just want to add on to what Lesego was mentioning, the role of the youth. The youth need to recognize the power that they have and start holding leadership accountable, because you cannot strengthen leadership to what they say and their outcomes unless you hold them accountable for development outcomes. So there's multiple ways that the youth are doing that, and you play quite a critical role also yourself, Victor, in your profession. But social platforms, social activism, using the media that we have in terms of holding people accountable and advocating for transparency. Definitely, because there's a lack of information dissemination, people don't know what's going on. But holding leadership accountable for stated outcomes and development outcomes is a critical responsibility that we all have, especially the youth. So yeah, that's it from my side.
Okay, yeah, this one last question, I want to put it through to all the three of you, starting with Alim. I just want to know what are some of the initiatives that we could implement for the reset to be more effective, be it at national level like in Botswana or global village level.
Yeah, I think a few ideas from my side is, and maybe I could track it against the three impact areas that Global Shape is focused on globally as well, if possible. The first one, which is we focus a lot on education and employment. Yes, I do believe that there is some kind of improvements to be made in like the K-12 education system. But I think what I'd maybe hone in on is the reskilling piece. So I think there needs to be a much better coordination between market-ready skills and what industry is demanding. And I think there must be a way to get a list of all the kind of formal employers in Botswana and to track what are the kind of job postings that they are putting out that they're unable to find people for. That should then be able to help us inform what kind of reskilling programs that we should have. Because my concern, and this is at a global level, it's not specific to any given country, is that a lot of times we see reskilling efforts that reskill people, that improve their employability, but don't necessarily land to employment. And so you just have a highly savvy, skilled youth workforce that is still very much unemployed as they were before those skilling efforts. So I would love to see one of the ways in which we reset our systems is to look at how do you bridge the gap between improved employability and employment. And the best way to do that is to look at what are the most frequent job postings that, and unfortunately, I think it might only work for like the formal economy. What are the jobs that are constantly being put out there? And what's the gaps that inhibit young people from gaining those jobs. Of course, like these ridiculous requirements that Lesejo just alluded to, of like you need to have 4 lifetimes worth of experience to gain your first job, or you need to have 14 PhDs to be able to get an entry. Like that thing needs to just go. It's completely obnoxious. But I think, yeah, how do we reorient our skilling efforts, our reskilling efforts to exactly what the market needs, and not just blowing with the wind and guessing based off what international publications might suggest, because that's really for the macro, and it's always very different at the country level. So that's one. Number two, I would say, is around the piece around youth and public engagement. I would love to see younger people more actively involved in their political decision-making process. And that doesn't mean just holding a picket sign. It doesn't mean just going on Twitter and writing a few things that reflect what you think. Of course, I'm not saying don't do that, but it means more consciously voting. It means more consciously following policies and trying to make sure they're as representative of different groups. It's a case of also constantly listening to different groups that represent your country. If you do have an opportunity to meet somebody who doesn't represent your lived experience, have that dialogue and conversation, so that if you are in a place one day, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, maybe even next year, where you're in a decision-making process, you're better able to reflect those needs at the same time too. I think we as young people constantly say, I want to make sure my government is representative of this. I want to make sure they're accountable to X, Y, and Z. But if I was to put any one of us to a group of even younger people, and they were to put questions to us to say, you've got more experience, you're better networked than me, how can I hold you accountable? I think we would find that experience maybe slightly overwhelming too. So it's just a case of constantly making sure you're as informed as possible, so that you just have to constantly remember you could be that person in the decision of influence. And it's very easy to be that person that does very little. It's very easy. What's more difficult is to step up and really take on that task. And that constantly requires you to build your information base, to understand different lived experiences, to constantly enlighten yourself. So I really hope that enlightenment shows up in how young people participate in public service leadership and in their relationship with government as well. So I would say that's the second one. And I think the third one is just broadly speaking about how we approach youth activism. So kind of reorienting ourselves back to the importance of the 3 Ps: people, power, politics. To understand we're up against systemic challenges, it requires systemic solutions. It's a long-term process. You cannot expect change to happen in a minute. Always think about your well-being, because you will be up against a long fight and a tiresome fight as well. So you have to always prioritize your well-being at the same time too. And always remember the power of intergenerational allyship. So pairing the wisdom of those before us with the enthusiasm of the current, I think there's tremendous power in that too. So I would reset those 3 just off the top of my head now. Victor, you're on mute.
Lesejo, do you still remember the question?
I think I do.
I ranted a bit.
It was what we want to reset, right?
Yes.
I think I would.
Yeah,
yes.
I was saying the initiative that needs to be implemented for us to say we are now a reset, either at national level or global village level.
Okay, I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I was looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and I was wondering, how would this apply to Botswana? What would this look like here? And there was a particular one that stood out for me, which was about defunding the police. And I was like, that sounds extreme. That sounds quite crazy. What does that even mean? But I was just thinking about some of the social issues we've been having recently as a country. We know the gender-based violence statistics have been alarming and quite scary, to be quite honest. Personally, having been a victim of a smash and grab, just safety has been a big issue for a lot of people within the country. And I think resetting for me would look like, how do we reprioritize community-focused programs within our country so that we bring back safety, we bring back a sense of ownership in terms of how we do things, how do we protect women and vulnerable groups, particularly children as well, in regards to this issue of violence and sexual abuse. So I think if we're going to reimagine our financing and our budgeting at a national level, how do we remove funding from certain entities that probably don't even need them or might not be relevant to more pressing issues within our country? So I think for me, that would be the biggest reset that we could do. Yeah.
Great. Simon, same question, please.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, so not too dissimilar to what Lesego has said and some elements of what Alim spoke about. So the first for me is definitely a reset in terms of national development planning. I've mentioned this earlier on, moving from the input-based approach to an output-based approach, which is based on a multidimensional criteria assessment, okay, in terms of how you prioritize, select, and fund projects, okay? And there's various criteria that we can debate in terms of how you do that. And the challenge, I think, is that when that is done, the biggest barrier, I think, will actually be Botswana, because I've had different discussions with different people in political leadership and in private sector. If you now imagine a member of parliament, Victor, going to a constituency and saying, but rather I'm going to invest 100 million pula in R&D for agriculture, IoT related services. It's going to be a big debate. And so, as you said, Alim, we have to take a very long-term view and see that the social benefits to be derived from those bold and courageous decisions far outweigh the political short-term gains, okay? And that's where the activism and the youth really come in. So that's the first one for me, Victor, very, very key. Resetting the NDP process and planning horizons. The second one for me is really around fast-tracking the improvement in the business ecosystem in Botswana. This is everything from ease of doing business, the competitive landscape, which actually speaks to bringing in also the informal sector and removing some of the red tape and excessive administrative barriers that we have. Okay, that's quite critical in terms of ease of doing business. The third area for me, of course, being in the private sector, is really around how do you incentivize in a socially responsible way the private sector to actually fast track the development of productive assets and infrastructure in the country. I think that's a really critical conversation. All assets across, and as I mentioned, cross-sectorally, where they have a multiplier effect. Those would be the three key resets, I think, that would be required. And it requires lots of more conversations, such as the one we're having with the right people.
Great stuff. We have run out of time, and I want us to end the conversation here. But before we could go, I want each one of you to use 30 seconds, just roughly 30 seconds, to pick the highlights from what your co-panelists said. Just pick 30 seconds of, just use your 30 seconds to pick what you see as a highlight from what the other panelists said, starting with Lesego.
I think for me, definitely what Simon mentioned around cross-sectoral approach to how we do business, and also the PPP approach. I think there is a great opportunity there. And what Abdullahi mentioned around youth activism, I think we really don't focus on it enough, particularly in Botswana. I think there's a great opportunity for us to really think more intentionally about how we keep our leaders accounting for what they do.
Great stuff. Simon?
Thanks, Victor. So 2 points. The first, obviously, yes, youth activism and their role in terms of public leadership. You got me thinking about myself, Alim, and how I can get into public service. I'm not yet there, but definitely I think that was a key takeaway for myself. And then the second one was around the people power and the 3 Ps: people, power, and politics. I think that was quite key in terms of the interplay and the intersection of that, people recognizing that role. So I think that was quite a key takeaway from my side.
Alim?
Yeah, I really enjoyed today's conversation. In fact, I don't know if it was obvious from my eye signal movement, but I was also texting just the organizers to say I've learned so much from today's discussion. I think I really enjoyed much of what Simon shared in today's conversation, and as well as Lesego as well. And I think, Lesego, the point that you had raised about frontline informal workers, and making sure that they are also very much central to our recovery and our reimagining is something that I think it's a thought that I've just kind of brought to the forefront of my own mind, and I think I'm going to continue to think of what that practically means for us moving forward as well. So I've learned a lot in today's discussion. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the audience on the online. We wish, and I wish to encourage you to take the conversation to the online platforms, the global shapers online platforms, the Facebook and the Twitter handle. We need to continue talking on the issues relating to income inequality, the issues relating to climate change, and most importantly, on how we should balance the interests of the citizens of the world and this interconnected world. Thank you very much, and see you on the next series.